A quiet countryside with a dark awakening nestled in the sprawling golden fields of Nebraska was a picturesque town called Fairhaven. To an outsider, it seemed like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, a place of neatly trimmed hedges, weathered mailboxes proudly bearing family names, and a lone gas station manned by the same old-timer who could recall every major storm of the last 50 years. Life in Fairhaven was slow, predictable, and bound by a strong unspoken code of familiarity and community. The Conways had always been seen as the archetypal small-town family. George Conway, the breadwinner, worked tirelessly in construction, often leaving home for weeks at a time to earn a living. His wife Rebecca embodied the resilience of a Midwestern woman, strong, resourceful, and fiercely protective of her two children, Emily and Sam. To neighbors, they were the kind of family you might nod to at the Sunday service potluck or exchange a polite wave with while passing their wide front porch adorned with a rocking chair and flower pots. But like so many others, their home concealed vulnerabilities that they tried desperately to shield from the outside world. On the surface, Fairhaven was a sanctuary. It was that kind of place where doors remained unlocked, and children cycled down dusty roads without fear. Even the occasional scandal, a teenage pregnancy or a heated zoning debate at the town hall, felt manageable for such a tight-knit community. Yet, beneath this surface of tranquility, Fairhaven was not untouched by complexity. Behind closing doors and window blinds, stories brewed, spoken in whispers and carried in furtive glances. One of these stories belonged to Charles Doran. Charles was the kind of man whose presence made you instinctively reach for your children's hands. Towering, unkempt, and frequently reeking of whiskey, Charles had cultivated a reputation as Fairhaven's resident troublemaker. He had once been a promising high school athlete with college scholarships in line, but as often happens with fading youthful brilliance, life took him on a darker path. Alcoholism slid into his life like an unwelcome guest, while bitterness nestled deep into his demeanor. Charles was loud, intrusive, and unashamedly antagonistic to anyone who stood up to him. Most people in town learned to coexist by simply avoiding confrontation, all except the Conway family. In his drunken ramblings, Charles had blamed George Conway for the failure of a long-lost pipe dream, perhaps a misplaced jealousy of George's labor on construction sites, or resentment that George had a family who endured life's hardships with dignity. Whatever the reason, Charles found in the Conways a convenient outlet for every ounce of his anger. His harassment began with small provocations, loitering on their property, yelling vulgarities when passing by. Soon it escalated to crude advances toward Rebecca, made worse by the stark knowledge that George was often away. Rebecca bore these insults with unshakable resolve, hoping anxiously that Charles would find a new target. But Fairhaven's unspoken fairness was lost on Charles, and his behavior grew bolder. On summer days, even when the August heat thickened the air, Rebecca found herself closing the storm windows tightly to muffle Charles's drunken tirades from trailing into her ears and shaking her already frayed resolve. Emily and Sam, still small and impressionable, began asking nervously why the shouting man always hung around their house. Rebecca, ever the determined protector, would smile softly and usher them inside, promising they need not worry. Her primary fear wasn't for herself, it was for the kids, for the family's stability, for keeping their sanctuary intact. It was on one of these quiet afternoons that the last vestiges of peace in the Conway household were shattered. Charles, staggering from the tavern and simmering with unwarranted fury, made unauthorized entry into the Conway home as the children were napping upstairs. Rebecca stood frozen in the dimly lit kitchen, clutching a rolling pin, fear battling defiance in her chest. In that moment, the unbreakable tranquility that Fairhaven prided itself on fractured irreparably. The events of that evening would forever mark the Conways and unveil Fairhaven's facade, forcing a reckoning that exposed both human vulnerability and the unseen dangers of isolation. The tale of a menacing neighbor. If a town's personality could be painted on a canvas, Fairhaven was a masterpiece of harmonious pastels. But every masterpiece has at least one dark shade, a shadow that blurs the edges of perfection. For Fairhaven, that shadow had a name: Charles Doran. Charles had always been a towering, imposing figure in the eyes of the townsfolk, but not for reasons anyone would admire. He was the kind of man whose sheer presence made young mothers shuffle their children indoors and shopkeepers reach for the closed sign a little earlier than usual. Standing at nearly 6'4" with a frame built like a prizefighter gone to seed, Charles was a walking storm cloud. His appearance alone, a scraggly beard peppered with gray, eyes perpetually bloodshot from whiskey-fueled nights, and sweat-stained t-shirts that hung loosely over his hefty frame, was enough to make strangers uneasy. His story wasn't always one of infamy. Once upon a time, Charles was the pride of Fairhaven's high school football team. Local newspapers had heralded him as a rising star, and whispers of college recruiters circling the sidelines floated through town like autumn leaves. But life has a way of twisting potential into discontent. An injury took him off the field for good, and with it vanished dreams of glory. Over time, bitterness replaced ambition, and the bottle became his most loyal companion. By the time the Conways moved into their modest home on Maple Run, Charles was well known around the town, but not in the way anyone would want to be. His reputation preceded him like storm clouds on the horizon. Fairhaven residents spoke of him in hushed tones over coffee at the local diner, or while waiting in line at the town's modest post office. "Trouble follows him," they'd say, shaking their heads solemnly. "Best to leave him be, don't poke the bear." For years, that's exactly what townsfolk did, navigate life around Charles as though he were an open pothole on the main road. He had become something of a town-wide inconvenience that people silently tolerated. Most chose the path of least resistance, avoidance. But not everyone could escape his path, least of all the Conways, who made the fatal mistake of simply existing in a world Charles wanted to control. It started small, a muttered curse when Charles passed their house on particularly drunken nights. Beer bottles left smashed at the edge of their driveway, the sort of petty, passive-aggressive nuisances that most would shrug off and chalk up to an unstable temperament. George Conway, being a man of patience and practicality, initially paid little attention to Charles's antics. He reasoned that engaging with a man like Charles was akin to fanning a flame; it would only get worse. "Don't mind him," George told Rebecca between bites of a Sunday breakfast as Charles stumbled past their yard, yelling incoherent insults. "He's all bark, no bite." The problem, though, was that Charles did bite. His taunts escalated over time. One chilly November evening, Rebecca found him leaning lazily against the Conways' mailbox, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Nice flowers, Rebecca," he slurred, motioning toward the pots that adorned her porch. "Bet you planted them all pretty just to impress me." The leer on his face made her stomach churn, but she kept her composure, forcing a tight-lipped smile before retreating inside. From that night forward, Charles became an unwelcomed fixture in their lives. Rare was the evening when he wasn't hovering just a bit too close to their property, eyes scanning their home with a dangerous mix of curiosity and contempt. George's long absences for work only emboldened Charles, who began loitering with a nerve that thickened like the smoke from the cigarettes he constantly lit. Rebecca's attempts at civility were met with mockery. "Always such a lady," Charles would chuckle, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't go thinking that makes you better than me." One night, the harassment boiled over in a way that solidified Charles's position as their personal tormentor. Rebecca had just finished tucking Emily and Sam into bed when a hard knock rattled the front door. Through the peephole she saw Charles, eyes wild with drink and fist poised to strike the door again. "Open up, Rebecca!" he shouted, voice slurred but forceful. "Wanted to let you know I'll be keeping an eye on things around here. It'd be a shame if anything were to, happen while George is away." Rebecca froze, her heart climbing into her throat. She didn't open the door that night, but Charles never let her forget his presence. Tensions reached a boiling point when he began invading their space physically. One afternoon, as Rebecca watered the lawn, she turned to find Charles casually strolling through the backyard as if invited. "Nice plot of land," he mused, gazing around. "I could see myself putting up a hammock right about there." He laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that felt more like a warning. Rebecca's pleas to the local police for intervention went largely ignored. Fairhaven wasn't the kind of place where law enforcement got involved in neighborly disputes. "He hasn't broken any laws, ma'am," the sheriff said one evening, more annoyed than concerned. "Best to just let him be, Charles is all talk." But Rebecca knew better. She wasn't alone in her unease. Mothers walking their children to school would cross the street at the sight of Charles. Teenagers dared each other to bike past his dilapidated house but never got too close. Even the town pastor seemed wary, once remarking during his Sunday sermon, "There are those among us who have let bitterness take root in their souls. Pray for them, yes, but also pray for yourselves." Charles's fixation on the Conways seemed to grow by the day, his advances bolder and his behavior more erratic. In Rebecca he saw both a target and a trophy, someone to dominate, someone to prove that he still held power in some corner of his fractured world. And in George's absence he found an opportunity to exploit. What Charles didn't realize, however, was that the quiet resolve of people like Rebecca and George could only stretch so far. A storm was brewing in Fairhaven, and at its center stood the Conways, caught between survival and a shadow that refused to fade. The woman who endured for her family. Rebecca Conway, like so many women in small-town America, had built her life around resilience and sacrifice. She was the kind of woman you'd find working tirelessly in her garden at sunrise or baking cookies for the church fundraiser, yet carrying burdens almost no one else could see. Her days revolved around two things: raising her children, Emily and Sam, and keeping her family intact despite the storms raging outside their well-worn but cozy front door. To outsiders, Rebecca seemed to be the epitome of composure. With her honey-blonde hair often tied into a neat ponytail and her warm but firm voice, the kind that could simultaneously comfort a crying child and chastise an unruly one, Rebecca gave off the impression of a woman in complete control. People in Fairhaven admired her from afar. A good mother, they would say, the backbone of that family while George is gone working those construction jobs. But under her calm demeanor, Rebecca was slowly, quietly breaking. It wasn't easy being the one to hold the family together while George spent weeks, sometimes months, away in the city, working to make ends meet. When he was gone, Rebecca carried the weight of everything: the bills, the kids' endless energy, the upkeep of the house, and now, of course, Charles Doran. The man's presence loomed over her life like a dark, heavy cloud. It began subtly enough, as most things do. Charles would linger just a moment too long when walking past the porch, or he'd call her name in that mocking, sing-song tone as she hung laundry on the line. At first, Rebecca told herself not to make trouble. It's just harmless, she thought. He'll move on to someone else eventually. But Charles didn't move on. He escalated. More than once, Rebecca would look up from her chores to see him perched on the edge of her property, his sharp eyes watching her like a predator studying prey. When George wasn't home, something Charles always made sure to note, he would creep closer. Afternoons spent playing with her children in the backyard became riddled with tension, her head constantly darting to and from the edge of the yard, scanning for movement in the tall grass that lined the lot. It wasn't just his physical presence that haunted her. Charles had a way of poisoning the air with his words even when he wasn't there. "What are you so scared of, Rebecca?" he'd call with a sneer during their rare confrontations. "You think your husband can protect you? He ain't even around." Rebecca tried to ignore him as best as she could, but the truth was, she felt completely exposed. She'd wake up some mornings to find cigarette butts on the front steps, beer cans lined neatly along the edge of their fence, or crude notes scrawled and left on the windshield of the family car. None of it was overtly violent, but that was almost worse. Each act felt like a calculated game, designed to remind her that Charles was always watching, always close. And then there were the nights. When the children were asleep and the house was finally quiet, Rebecca would lie in bed with the windows tightly shut, staring at the ceiling fan turning endlessly above her. Even with the doors locked and the storm windows bolted shut, she couldn't shake the feeling that Charles was right outside, hidden in the shadows of the darkened street. Emily, the eldest at just 8 years old, had begun to notice her mother's unease. "Mom, why does that man always yell when he sees you?" she asked one evening, her big, innocent eyes peering up from a half-eaten bowl of mac and cheese. Sam, her younger brother, chimed in nervously. "Is he a bad guy?" Rebecca just smiled faintly, stroking Emily's hair. "Don't you worry about him," she said softly. "It's not your job to worry about things like that. Mommy will keep you safe." But Rebecca knew it wasn't that simple. The breaking point came one sweltering afternoon in mid-July. The sun had blazed down on Fairhaven all day, baking the streets and leaving the air sticky and oppressive. Rebecca had made it a point to keep the kids inside where it was cooler. But at some point, Sam had decided to wander into the backyard, carrying with him his favorite toy truck. Rebecca stood at the kitchen sink, the hum of the window air conditioner masking the sound of her distant thoughts, when she caught movement from the corner of her eye, Charles, standing at the edge of the yard. "Nice day, huh?" he called, his voice low and slick with that familiar condescension. Rebecca froze. Sam was just feet away from him, sitting cross-legged by a small patch of dandelions. She felt her pulse spike, her vision narrowing, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She couldn't seem to move, to yell, to do anything except grip the edge of the sink until her knuckles turned white. "Come here, kid," Charles drawled, looking down at Sam with what he probably thought was a harmless grin. "You want to see something cool?" "No." Rebecca's mind screamed the word, but her throat couldn't produce the sound. She lurched forward, tearing open the door and running into the sunlight. "Sammy, come inside now!" Her voice was sharp enough to slice through the thick heat hanging in the air. To his credit, Sam obeyed immediately, dragging his truck with him as he toddled back up the steps. Rebecca stood stock still on the porch, her heart hammering in her chest as she locked eyes with Charles. "What?" he said, shrugging with exaggerated innocence. "Just saying hey to the little guy." His grin widened, and then he tipped an imaginary hat to her. "You have a nice day, Rebecca." It wasn't until the door was bolted firmly behind her, and the kids were safely tucked into their room that Rebecca allowed herself to cry. It wasn't a gentle cry either, it was raw, guttural. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep inside you almost don't recognize your own voice. Charles had taken something from her that July day. He had taken the illusion of safety, the belief that her world could be kept intact for her children as long as she stayed strong. She felt like a failure. Still, even in the depths of her despair, Rebecca refused to break. She had 2 children to protect, a husband who needed her to be strong. No matter how close Charles got, no matter how much he poisoned her life with his presence, Rebecca vowed that she would endure, for her family, for the fragile sanctuary they called home. But enduring always has its limits. A violence beyond the breaking point. It happened on a night that started like any other in Fairhaven, with the gentle hum of cicadas filling the summer air, and the crickets composing the background of another uneventful evening. Rebecca had finally managed to get Emily and Sam tucked into bed after hours of fielding their endless energy. George was gone, as he so often was, working a construction job 2 hours away, leaving the house eerily quiet apart from the rhythmic creak of the ceiling fan in the tiny living room. For a brief moment, Rebecca let herself exhale as the clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight. Across town, however, Charles Duran was deep into his 5th, perhaps his 6th, glass of whiskey. He had been at the only bar Fairhaven had to offer, the place he referred to as his office, growling his latest grievances to whoever was unfortunate enough to stand within earshot. By now, most of the patrons had cleared out, leaving only Charles, the barkeep, and the unmistakable odor of stale alcohol that seemed to cling to him. "Been too damn quiet over at the Conways," Charles muttered under his breath as he sloppily threw a few wadded bills onto the bar. His slurred words barely registered with the bartender, who wordlessly filled his last glass before turning the lights down. "Damn George," Charles added, standing with an unsteady wobble. "Think he's above me, thinking he can escape his old pal Charles." Whatever toxic concoction brewed in Charles's mind that night led him out into the hot, sticky evening. His body moved more on instinct than plan, his boots kicking up dust as he staggered toward Maple Run. What began as a vague urge to assert himself sharpened midway through the walk. This wasn't just about scaring Rebecca, it was about reminding her who held the power. Rebecca was folding laundry at the kitchen table when she heard a noise outside the house, a shuffling, deliberate sound, not the wind or a wandering raccoon but something human. Her heartbeat quickened, palms damp as she froze with a dish towel in hand. And then came the knock. No, more like a pounding. Rebecca made her way to the front door cautiously, her breath catching in her chest as the pounding grew louder, angrier. Through the peephole, she saw him, Charles, swaying slightly, his face flushed from whiskey and rage. His fist was raised, ready to strike the door again. "Rebecca!" Charles bellowed, his voice slicing through the quiet like a knife. "Open the damn door, you hear me?" She froze. Her first instinct was to grab the phone to call the sheriff's office, but then she remembered their last conversation with law enforcement. "He hasn't done anything illegal," the sheriff had said dismissively, brushing off her pleas for help. "Best to just ignore him, ma'am. He'll wear himself out eventually." But Charles wasn't wearing himself out tonight. "I know you're in there!" he snarled. He pressed his face against the door, his breath fogging up the glass. "Don't make me come in myself, Rebecca." She stepped back, her hands trembling as they clutched the back of the kitchen chair. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, toward Emily and Sam, who were still asleep upstairs, oblivious to the brewing chaos below. She needed to keep them safe. "Go away, Charles!" She finally shouted through the door, infusing her voice with as much strength as she could muster. But her defiance only spurred him on. "Go away!" He laughed, a humorless, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Go away! This ain't your house, Rebecca! This is my town!" And then to her horror he stepped back, his hulking frame silhouetted by the porch light, and slammed his boot into the door. The wood splintered under his weight on the second kick, the lock giving way with a sickening crunch. Rebecca stumbled backward, her mind racing as Charles stumbled into the house, his shadow stretching ominously across the linoleum floor. "You shouldn't have made me do that," he snapped, his eyes bloodshot as they scanned the room. His grin was wolfish as he caught sight of her, the raw malice in his expression sending her pulse skyrocketing. "Now you've gone and made me mad." Rebecca snatched up the closest object in reach, a cast-iron skillet lying on the countertop, and gripped its handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Stay away, Charles." Her voice wavered but didn't break. The kids are here. You don't want to do this." But Charles's sense of morality had long since eroded, buried under years of self-loathing and bottom-shelf whiskey. He merely laughed, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest. "Do this?" he sneered, stepping closer. "Ah, Becky, you think I don't know he's gone? George ain't coming to save you, it's just you and me now." The skillet trembled in her grip as he advanced. Rebecca's mind raced, scenarios flashing one after another as she calculated her next move. Every survival instinct screamed at her to fight, to lash out, but she couldn't forget the two little souls sleeping upstairs. If she fought him, and lost, Charles reached out, his hand grabbing for her wrist. She reacted in a flash, swinging the skillet hard, a desperate, instinctive act. Metal connected with flesh in a sickening thud, and Charles reeled backward, clutching his arm with a curse. "Oh, you're gonna regret that," he hissed, his features twisting into a mask of unrestrained fury. The rest of the night unraveled in a whirlwind of chaos. Charles managed to grab her, pinning her to the floor with his weight as she thrashed and fought beneath him. The screams that escaped her lips were raw and primal, her lungs burning as adrenaline surged through her veins. Somewhere in the scuffle, Charles raised a fist, and then everything blurred into darkness. When Rebecca finally regained her senses, he was gone. The front door hung ajar, swinging slightly in the summer breeze. Her cheeks were damp with tears she didn't remember crying, and her entire body ached from head to toe. For a long time she lay on the cold kitchen floor, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Upstairs, Emily and Sam remained blissfully unaware, their dreams uninvaded by the horrors that had unfolded just below. But Rebecca knew better. The man who had shattered the sanctity of her home that night wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Something inside her had begun to fracture, and though she had endured for her family's sake for so long, she knew, deep down, that the limits of her endurance were dangerously close to breaking. The husband returns to discover the tragedy. George Conway drove the familiar stretch of Highway 34 with tired eyes and aching hands, his truck rattling over uneven asphalt as the flat horizon of Nebraska stretched endlessly ahead. A storm was brewing in the distance, the kind of slow-building thunderclouds that rolled in over the plains and felt like they'd been building for weeks. He barely noticed them. His mind was on getting home, the small house on Maple Run, the laughing voices of Emily and Sam, and the comforting weight of Rebecca's embrace. It had been 3 weeks since George had last crossed the town's limits. Another construction job in Dallas had kept him away for longer than he liked, but the paycheck had been worth it. At least, he told himself it had been. Rebecca had sounded strained on the phone last Saturday, but George chalked it up to the stress of juggling kids, bills, and everything else life threw her way in his absence. She had said she missed him, but there had been something in her voice, a tension she hadn't let seep into her words. When George pulled up to the house, it was just past sundown. The porch light flickered weakly in its sconce and the yard was oddly quiet. Usually Sam would come running out, truck in hand, ready to tackle him before he even made it up the steps. Emily would trail behind, scolding her brother for being too rough, while Rebecca stood smiling on the porch with her arms folded. It was an image George played on repeat in his mind every time he was on the road, the picture of the life he worked so hard to preserve. But tonight, no one came to greet him. George stepped out of the truck, his work boots hitting the gravel with a crunch. "Rebecca?" he called, his voice carrying into the humid summer air. "Kids?" Nothing. The air felt heavier than it should have. As he climbed the porch steps, George noticed something strange. The front door had been repaired. Fresh wood patched a section near the bottom, where it looked like someone had kicked their way through. His stomach tightened as he reached for the doorknob. It wasn't just repaired, it was reinforced with new locks and a chain he'd never seen before. "Rebecca?" he called again, louder this time. When he stepped inside, the house was clean but eerily silent. A candle burned low on the kitchen counter, its wax pooled thick around a neglected wick. The scent of lavender hung faintly in the air, but nothing about it felt calming. George's eyes swept the room. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but something was off. He found Rebecca sitting at the dining table, her hands folded tightly around a cup of tea gone cold. Her face was pale, and dark shadows clung beneath her eyes like bruises. She didn't look up when he entered. "Rebecca," George said softly, stepping closer. She flinched, just barely, but it was enough to make George freeze. He had seen many things on construction sites, injuries, accidents, even grief, but nothing prepared him for the fragile shell of his wife that sat before him. What's going on?" he asked hesitantly, lowering himself into the chair across from her. Rebecca finally lifted her eyes to meet his, but they were distant, hollow in a way that sent a cold sweat trickling down George's spine. "He came back," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry twigs underfoot. George blinked, confused. "Who? What are you talking about?" Her lips quivered for a moment as she searched for the words. "Charles." She said the name like it physically hurt to let it leave her mouth. The name hit George like a sledgehammer to the chest. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Charles? Doran?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Rebecca nodded slowly, tears beginning to pool in the corner of her eyes. "He broke in, George," she whispered. "That night, he broke the door down and he—" Her voice faltered as her hands gripped the mug tighter, her knuckles turning white. George felt something primal and cold twist in his gut. "What did he do?" he asked, his voice hardening as the words left his mouth. Rebecca inhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling like she was trying to push back the memory with sheer force of will. "He came for me," she said finally, her voice trembling but firm. "I tried to fight him off, I swear I did, but he—" Her voice broke and her head dropped into her hands. George felt the blood drain from his face. His hands clenched into fists on the table as a storm of emotions surged through him. Guilt, rage, helplessness, all colliding in a way that left him paralyzed. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her everything would be okay, but he couldn't. How could anything be okay after hearing this? Did he hurt the kids?" George forced the words out, his throat tight. Rebecca shook her head quickly. "No, they didn't see it. I got him out before they woke up." Her voice was small, like she was confessing a sin, but there was a steely edge beneath her grief. "But he's not done, George. He's not going to stop." George sat back in the chair, his mind reeling with the weight of it all. He had told himself for years that Charles was just a drunken fool, harmless despite his loud mouth and bad temper. But now, looking at his wife, the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion lining her face, he realized how wrong he'd been. "I should have been here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Rebecca looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Don't you dare do that to yourself!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "This isn't your fault. You had to work. You had to provide for us. This is his fault. This is Charles." George nodded numbly, his jaw tightening as something cold and furious settled in his chest. He reached across the table, covering Rebecca's trembling hands with his own. "He's not coming back," he said firmly, his voice low and steady. "Not ever again." Rebecca shook her head, her expression crumbling under the weight of his words. "You don't understand, George. He's fearless. He thinks he owns this place. He thinks he owns me." George locked eyes with her, his brows furrowing as a quiet resolve settled over him. "I don't care what he thinks. If he comes near you, or the kids, again—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. For the next few hours, Rebecca told him everything. She recounted the months of torment, Charles's leering comments, the smashed bottles on their property, the nights she huddled in fear, praying he wouldn't come back. By the time she finished, George felt like an entirely different man. He went upstairs to check on the kids, lingering in the doorway of their room longer than usual. Emily was curled up with her stuffed rabbit, while Sam snored lightly, his toy truck clutched tightly in his small hands. They looked so peaceful, so blissfully unaware of the storm raging just outside their little world. But George couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The reckless plan of a man, pushed to the edge. George Conway had always been the calm one, steady, calculated, and patient. He was a man who believed that problems could be solved with hard work and a level head. But now, as he sat alone in the truck in the darkness outside his home, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, that part of him was gone. In its place was something darker, rawer, a fire that had been simmering for far too long and had finally reached its breaking point. It had been 2 sleepless nights since Rebecca told him everything. 2 nights of seeing the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at the slightest sound, how she couldn't walk near the front door without checking the new locks obsessively. 2 nights of watching his kids sleep peacefully upstairs, unaware of the storm brewing around them, a storm George could no longer ignore. In his mind, the sheriff's words echoed like a cruel joke. "We'll look into it," the man had said dismissively when George showed up at the station the day after he got home. "But like I told your wife, Charles hasn't broken any laws that we can prove. Maybe if something concrete comes up." Something concrete. What more did they want? His wife and kids were prisoners in their own home, barricaded behind locks and bolted windows, because a drunken predator felt entitled to torment them. The law would only move when it was too late, when Charles went too far, when Rebecca or the kids got hurt. George wasn't willing to wait for that. That night, as the house lay in quiet, restless slumber, George sat at the kitchen table with an old notepad and a pen. It wasn't in his nature to script something so impulsive as a plan of attack, but he forced himself to think clearly, to stay in control. The ink on the page was smudged from where his sweaty hands rested, but he didn't stop writing. Step by step he laid it out, how to confront Charles, how to ensure Rebecca and the kids wouldn't be harmed, and above all, how to make it clear to the both of them that this would end. Charles would get the message, once and for all, that he wasn't welcome anywhere near the Conways. But as George planned, the anger he thought he could corral into a rational scheme began to spill over, tainting his judgment. Once the first idea of confrontation turned into thoughts of violence, the door was open, and the flood followed. He thought of the fear in Rebecca's voice every time she said Charles's name, the broken front door and the shadows it represented, the humiliation she must have felt fighting him off. The rage burned hotter than ever. "This ends now," George muttered under his breath, tearing through the notepad page. By the time dawn began to creep over the Nebraska horizon, George had discarded any thought of civil confrontation. What was the point? Reasoning with a man like Charles, a man who thrived off control and fear, was like trying to patch a collapsing dam with duct tape. Charles wouldn't stop until someone made him stop. And for years, nobody else in Fairhaven, least of all the authorities, had been willing to do what needed to be done. So, George decided it would be him. The first part of his plan was to keep things quiet. Rebecca couldn't know. She would stop him. For her sake, for the children's sake, she would beg him to let this go, to put his faith in the system that had already failed them. She wouldn't understand, not fully. She was too strong, too loving, too focused on moving forward to let herself succumb to the kind of rage that had taken over George. But George wasn't thinking about moving forward. To him, the only way forward was through Charles. He spent the better part of the day gathering what he needed. He bought a heavy chain and a padlock at the local hardware store, reasoning with the cashier about needing extra chains for securing his truck bed. A few hours later he stopped at a pawn shop in a neighboring town, where he paid cash for something he'd never imagined owning. A gun. The weapon felt foreign and heavy in his hands, but George told himself it was a necessary evil. He wasn't planning to use it, not unless he absolutely had to, but it was better to have it and not need it than the other way around. By the time he returned home late that evening, his plan was solidified in his mind, the steps clear and calculated. Charles would be leaving the town bar around 11 p.m. He always did. Drunk, stumbling, muttering to himself about who or what had wronged him that day. It was a predictable ritual, one George had heard repeated through town gossip over the years. Tonight, though, things wouldn't go according to Charles's routine. George parked his truck at the edge of the dirt road leading to Charles's property, turning off the headlights as he killed the engine. The night was dark and humid, the only sounds the distant hum of crickets and the occasional snapping of a twig underfoot. In the truck bed lay the chain, the padlock, and the weapon, not loaded, but ready if his hand was forced. George didn't think about the consequences, the potential for things to spiral out of control. His mind focused solely on the end game, ensuring Charles would never set foot near his family again. When Charles finally emerged from the bar, lurching toward the road like a ship navigating stormy seas, George could feel his pulse roaring in his ears. The fire that had been building in his chest over the past few days burned hotter. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, waiting for the right moment. Charles stumbled onto the dirt path toward his house, mumbling something George couldn't make out. Before he could think better of it, before reason had a chance to intervene, George stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he called into the night. "Charles!" The larger man froze, squinting into the darkness. "Who the hell?" he slurred, his voice already laced with irritation. "That you, Conway? What you want at this hour?" George stepped forward, his presence steady and silent, the tension in the air thick and electric. "What I want," George said, his voice low and deliberate, "is for you to stay the hell away from my family. You come near my wife, my kids, or my home ever again." He paused, his hand brushing the edge of his pocket where the gun was hidden. "You're gonna wish you never set foot in Fairhaven." Charles chuckled, a deep, menacing laugh that echoed in the stillness. "Is that right? Little Georgie finally grew a backbone?" He stepped closer, his towering frame swaying slightly but still dangerous. "You think you're the boss now, huh? Hate to break it to you, but this is my town." George didn't flinch, his hand tightening over the weapon in his jacket. What happened next wasn't part of George's plan, but then again, plans rarely hold up against desperation. A death on a cold winter night. The night air was sharper than a blade, cutting through Fairhaven with a biting chill that settled deep into the bones. A rare snowfall had blanketed the Nebraska fields in a pristine white glow, muffling the world into an almost eerie silence. It was the kind of cold that didn't simply sting but wrapped tight around everything it touched, slowing even the smallest movements. The moon cast a pale light over Maple Run, making it look ethereal, ghost-like in the dead of winter. Charles Doran didn't seem to notice the cold, or maybe he just didn't care. Wrapped in an old army surplus jacket that hung loose over his bulky frame, he staggered down the dark road toward his house, a bottle clutched in one meaty hand and the other shoved deep into his pocket. His breath, thick and heavy with the scent of cheap whiskey, came out in quick white clouds, disappearing into the icy night. For any other man, the bitter frost would have been enough to keep him indoors, but not Charles. The liquor had created a warmth in his body that the biting wind couldn't breach, or so he thought. He muttered to himself as he walked, his words as fragmented and broken as the man himself. "Damn Conways, thinking they're better'n me. George!" He spat the name as if it tasted bitter. It wasn't entirely clear if Charles even had a destination in mind that night. Perhaps he felt like standing on Rebecca's porch again, testing her patience just for the thrill of watching her squirm behind that brave face she wore. Or maybe he was too far gone to care where his feet were taking him. Whatever the reason, the road to his house took him down the same dirt stretch where George Conway had parked his truck hours earlier. George watched from his truck, the engine silent, his breath fogging the inside of the windows. His plan, the reckless, simmering plot he'd spent the past hours convincing himself was right, had reached the point of no return. He had been sitting there for what felt like an eternity, rehearsing the confrontation over and over in his mind. But now, as the distant figure of Charles emerged from the shadows, the reality of the moment finally settled over him like a crushing weight. This wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. This was about drawing a line in the sand, about facing the thing he'd tried to ignore for far too long. George stepped out of the truck, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he moved into the road. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and unforgiving, but he felt no urge to retreat. The fire burning inside him was hotter than the winter chill could ever hope to extinguish. "Charles!" he called out, his voice cutting through the frozen night. The figure stopped mid-step, the bottle in his hand swaying slightly before he tightened his grip. Charles squinted toward the sound. Recognition dawned slowly as a cruel grin began to stretch across his ruddy face. "Well, if it ain't George Conway," Charles slurred, his words rolling out like a taunt. "Decided to come out of hiding, huh? Thought you'd leave your poor little wife to deal with me on her own forever?" George stood his ground, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Stay away from my family," George said, his voice steady despite the thunderous pounding of his heart. Charles closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, the snow crunching beneath his ragged boots. The closer he got, the stronger the stench of alcohol and smoke became. He stopped just a few feet away from George and gave him an appraising look like a predator sizing up its prey. "Or what?" Charles sneered, his grin widening. "You finally gonna stand up for yourself, Georgie? Is that the plan?" George's hand tightened around the heavy chain he had brought with him, hidden behind his back. Even as his pulse roared in his ears, he forced himself to remain calm. He knew how this would end if he didn't. "You don't scare me, Charles," George said evenly. "But I'll tell you one thing. You're not stepping foot near my house again. You're done terrorizing Rebecca. You're done scaring my kids." The grin faded from Charles's face, replaced by a cold, dangerous expression that sent a chill down George's spine. "And if I'm not?" Charles asked, taking another step forward. "What if I decide to pay Becky another visit, huh? What are you gonna do about it, Georgie?" George's breath caught in his throat, his fury bubbling over as Charles uttered Rebecca's name like a curse. Before he could stop himself, his arm swung forward, the chain lashing out with a metallic clang as it struck Charles across the arm. The reaction was instant. Charles let out a guttural roar, dropping the bottle as it shattered against the icy ground. He charged at George with a wild, erratic force, his hands latching onto George's jacket as he shoved him backward into the snow. The two men grappled violently, their breaths misting in the freezing air as they fought for control. George's vision blurred with adrenaline, his muscles screaming as he pushed against Charles's crushing weight. The world around them seemed to shrink, the sound of their struggle echoing off the empty fields like gunfire. In the chaos, George felt his hand wrap around the cold steel of the gun tucked into his pocket. He didn't think. He didn't have time to. The weapon came up between them, and suddenly, the crack of the gunshot shattered the silence. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Charles froze, his body stiffening as his eyes widened in shock. Slowly he staggered back, his hand clutching at his side where dark blood began to stain the fresh white snow beneath their feet. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. George stood there, his chest heaving as he stared at the man who had haunted his family for so long. He hadn't meant for it to come to this. He had told himself 1,000 times that he'd stop before it went too far. But now, as Charles collapsed to his knees and fell face first into the snow, George realized there was no going back. The wind howled through the empty fields, carrying the sound of his ragged breathing as he stared down at the still form before him. Charles Doran was dead. The fire that had driven George to this moment began to flicker and fade, replaced by a cold, sinking emptiness. The weight of what he had done settled over him like the heavy snowfall around him. For a long while George didn't move. The night stretched on, silent and unrelenting, as the snow continued to fall. The discovery and police investigation. The morning after the storm, Fairhaven woke under a heavy blanket of white snow, the kind that transformed even the most familiar paths into alien landscapes. The sky was a muted gray, and the biting air carried a strange stillness, a quiet that wrapped itself around the town like a brittle veil. That stillness was broken by the shout of a young boy, loud and echoing in a way that sent ripples through the community's calm. Edward Thompson wasn't supposed to be out that morning. His mother had warned him time and again to avoid the canal, a cruel cutting waterway that divided Fairhaven's sprawling fields. But Edward, bundled up in an oversized coat and leaky boots, had gathered his friends for what should have been a fun morning of snowball fights and mischief. Instead, they found something far darker. The body of Charles Doran curled near the icy edge of the canal, frozen solid in death. The boys screamed, racing back to the main road as fast as their small legs could carry them, their breath misting in frightened gasps. By the time someone made the call to the sheriff's office, the whole town knew the news. Charles Doran was dead. Sheriff William Hardy arrived at the scene with a grim determination. He had been Fairhaven's top lawman for over 20 years, and in that time, he'd seen his fair share of petty thefts, illicit affairs, and the occasional family feud. But a murder? That was a rarity in this quiet farming town. Hardy stood at the edge of the canal, his boots crunching against the thin layer of ice and snow as his deputy, Kyle Evans, examined the body. Charles lay sprawled in the snow like a toppled statue, frozen stiff. In the early morning light his features looked pale and gray, a macabre reflection of the lifeless landscape around him. His jacket was heavy with patches of mud and blood, his lifeless hand gripping the remnants of a shattered whiskey bottle. "It's Charles, all right," Hardy muttered, squinting at the body from beneath the brim of his wide-brimmed hat. "Drunk more than he should have been, like every night." Evans, a younger and less weathered deputy, frowned as he studied the scene. "Drunk maybe, but this wasn't no accident. Look." He pointed to the visible gash in Charles's side, torn through the layers of cloth by a small-caliber bullet. Even through his thick gloves Hardy felt a chill climb up his spine. "Gunshot!" Hardy said, his voice grave. "Someone wanted him dead. Someone finished the job." The weight of that realization settled on the shoulders of both men. Fairhaven wasn't the kind of place where murder happened. Hardy's intuition told him this wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal, and, judging by the rumors about Charles's behavior around town, Hardy had a good feeling about who might be involved. By midday, the entire town knew about Charles's death, and the air was heavy with speculation and fear. In a place like Fairhaven, secrets were easy to bury but impossible to hide. Everyone knew Charles had been bad news, the kind of man who made enemies without even trying. He had disputes with shopkeepers who were fed up with his unpaid tabs. He'd scuffled with neighbors over property lines and spent too much time glaring at anyone he thought had wronged him. Most telling of all, however, were his endless run-ins with the Conways. Plenty of people had noticed the ominous shadow Charles had cast over Rebecca's life, the public taunts, the stares, and the tension that made people whisper about what might happen if George ever found out how far things had gone. Rebecca kept indoors that day, drawing the curtains tightly as she sat on the couch with Emily in her lap, and Sam playing quietly on the floor. George watched the phone like it was a ticking time bomb, knowing it wouldn't be long before they were dragged into what was coming. That call came just before sundown. "George Conway?" Hardy's voice was firm but calm when George answered the phone. "What's this about, Sheriff?" George asked, his tone measured. Hardy didn't miss a beat. "It's Charles Doran. His body was found this morning near the canal, shot dead." George's stomach twisted into a knot, but he didn't let it show. "Well, I guess someone finally had enough of him." "That's one way to put it," Hardy said dryly. "But here's my problem, George. Last we heard, Charles had a habit of stirring up trouble near your house." There it was. The words George had been waiting for, the accusation wrapped up neatly inside a questioning tone. "You think I had something to do with it?" George fired back, his voice hardening. "I think," Hardy said slowly, "that you've got plenty of reason to want Charles gone. Folks around here aren't blind. They've seen what he's been doing to your family. Hell, George, I'd understand if you snapped. But if there's more to this, you better tell me now." "More to this?" George repeated, his jaw tightening. "The man practically terrorized my wife and kids. If you want my help, you've got it. But I'm not a murderer." Hardy stayed silent for a moment, his breath heavy on the other end of the line. "You and Rebecca might want to come down to the station," he said finally, "sooner rather than later. The investigation was thorough, but Fairhaven didn't have the resources for the kind of forensic work that big cities relied on. Hardy didn't need high-tech labs or fingerprint databases to see that the Conway family stood at the center of the storm. Witnesses came forward, piece by piece, with clues that painted an incriminating picture. A mechanic said he'd seen George buying chains and hardware 2 nights before the murder. A bartender claimed Charles had gotten into an argument outside the bar that night with someone who sounded an awful lot like George. And Rebecca's co-workers whispered about how she'd been acting strange lately, flinching at loud noises, and jumping every time Charles's name came up. As the pressure mounted, Hardy and his deputies rolled up to the Conways' house with search warrants in hand. George didn't even flinch when they knocked, and Rebecca stayed upstairs with the children, holding them tightly in the small bedroom as heavy boots stomped through their home. In the garage, it didn't take long to find what they were looking for: a couple of stray links from the chain George had brought out that night, streaked with rust and something else, something darker. The final nail in the coffin came when a deputy unearthed George's firearm, tucked beneath a layer of tools and rags. The sheriff's eyes flashed with disappointment as he met George's steady gaze. "You should have told me, George." George didn't try to deny it. There was nothing left to say. By the end of the week, George Conway was formally charged with second-degree murder. Fairhaven, a town that prided itself on its quiet, law-abiding nature, was thrown into chaos. Some said George had done what any man would in his position, that he had stood up to a bully who deserved what was coming to him. Others whispered behind closed doors about how Rebecca must have known, how she had let George go too far. For the Conways, the nightmare had only just begun. The trial and motive behind the crime. The courtroom was packed on the first day of George Conway's trial, the air thick with a mix of tension, curiosity, and quiet sympathy. Fairhaven's courthouse had never seen a trial this sensational. Its modest wooden benches were filled with townsfolk, reporters, and even neighboring county residents who had come to witness what they were calling the most shocking case in the town's history. George sat at the defense table in a neatly pressed suit that felt stiff in more ways than one. His usually strong hands, weathered from years of construction work, rested motionless on the table, clasped together as though they held a prayer too fragile to let go of. His face gave away little, but the lines along his forehead seemed deeper, his eyes darker, weighed down by sleepless nights and the long road ahead. Rebecca sat directly behind him, her hands gripping the edge of the bench like a lifeline. Her presence was a silent declaration of loyalty, even as she bore the quiet whispers from onlookers, questioning if she had let her husband's anger consume him or even spurred him on. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously between George and the judge, but she never wavered in her focus. She was there as his anchor, his strength, and his last connection to the life they had shared before everything unraveled. The prosecution wasted no time painting George as a man consumed by rage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began District Attorney Nathan Clark, his voice sharp and deliberate as he paced in front of them, "what we have here is not an act of self-defense. This was not a moment of sudden panic or survival. This was premeditated murder, a cold, calculated plan to end the life of Charles Doran." Clark gestured toward the evidence table, where the chain, the firearm, and photographs of Charles's bloodied body lay in full view of the jury. George Conway didn't snap in the heat of the moment, Clark continued. He sat in his truck that night waiting. He bought supplies well before this confrontation. He brought a loaded weapon, and then, when the opportunity arose, he delivered a blow that would end one man's life and seek to justify it as protecting his family. The prosecutor's tone dripped with sarcasm on the last words, as he turned to meet the jury's gaze head-on. The townsfolk in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. While many sympathized with George, there was something chilling about the way the evidence neatly lined up with Clark's narrative. Rebecca winced as the prosecutor's words landed, replaying the months of terror she'd endured and the moment George told her Charles wouldn't be coming back. She wanted to scream that it wasn't like that George wasn't the monster they were portraying him to be, but all she could do was sit and silently will the jury to see the truth. George's defense attorney, Christopher Madden, was a wiry, graying man with a calm presence that unnerved the opposition. His approach was measured, deliberate, not designed to rebut everything the prosecution threw at him, but to make the jury see George from a different angle. When it was his turn, Madden stood slowly, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the room. "Let's not kid ourselves here," he began. "We're not talking about a saint in Charles Doran. This wasn't some innocent victim whose life was tragically cut short. By every account, every witness, every piece of gossip that's ever echoed through the walls of Fairhaven, Charles was a terrible human being. He was an abuser, a bully, and a man who fostered anger and fear wherever he went." Madden let the room sit in silence for a moment, watching the jury shift uncomfortably. "Now, does that excuse murder? No. But does it explain the actions of a man who, for too long, saw his family terrorized and his cries for help ignored? That's for you to decide." The trial's most harrowing moment came when Rebecca took the stand. As she walked to the witness box, a collective hush fell over the room. She looked small, almost swallowed by the oversized chair, and her trembling hands betrayed the inner storm she was trying desperately to calm. Rebecca squeezed the edge of the witness box as Clark approached her. His questions began gentle, almost rehearsed, but quickly became sharper, more piercing. "Mrs. Conway," Clark said, his voice dripping with feigned politeness, "would you say that you and your husband had discussed Charles Doran often?" "Yes," she answered cautiously. "And in these discussions, did George ever imply, did he ever suggest, he might take things into his own hands if the authorities didn't do anything about Charles?" His words were barbed with accusation, meant to trap her. Rebecca hesitated, her eyes darting toward George. He was frustrated," she admitted. "We both were. But George didn't want to hurt anyone. All he wanted was for the threats to stop, for our family to feel safe, that's all." Clark smiled faintly, as though her answer confirmed his suspicions. "And yet, Mrs. Conway, your husband waited outside on that dirt road with a gun and a chain. Is that the behavior of a man who didn't want to hurt anyone?" Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but her words faltered. When it was Madden's turn to question her, his tone was entirely different. Gentle, reassuring. He led Rebecca through the months of torment and terror, from Charles watching her from the edge of the property to his violent break-in on that fateful night. "Rebecca," Madden said softly, "if you could describe the fear you lived with because of Charles Doran, what would you say?" Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "It was suffocating. I didn't feel safe in my own home. Every time I heard footsteps outside or saw a shadow at the window, I thought it was him. I thought he was coming back." "And how did that affect George?" Rebecca hesitated, her voice breaking. "He blamed himself. He thought it was his fault that we weren't safe. He thought he wasn't doing enough to protect us." Madden nodded, his voice lowering to a near whisper as he asked his final question. "Would you say in some way Charles Doran killed the peace in your family long before that night?" Rebecca wiped at her tears, her voice trembling as she replied, "Yes." The trial stretched on for days, each testimony peeling back another layer of the tragedy that had unfolded. Friends, neighbors, and even the bartender from the bar where Charles spent his nights painted a picture of a man who had terrorized nearly everyone he encountered. But the focus never wavered from the central question. Was George Conway a man pushed to the brink, or a murderer who planned his actions? The jury deliberated for hours, their decision weighing heavily on their shoulders. When they returned, the courthouse was silent, the air electric with anticipation. The verdict was announced: guilty of second-degree murder. George sat stone-faced as the words echoed through the courthouse. Rebecca let out a muffled sob behind him, holding Emily and Sam close as if shielding them from the reality of what had just happened. George was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Some voices whispered that the sentence was too harsh, while others felt the law had done its duty. But for Rebecca and the children, it wasn't just a verdict. It was the moment their world collapsed. As people filed out of the courthouse after the sentencing, one sentiment hung heavy in the air. If George was guilty of anything, it was of loving his family too much to let them live in fear. But love and desperation, when pushed far enough, can lead to actions that no court of law could truly make sense of. And so, the tragedy of George Conway ended not with justice, but with heartbreak. The foster father and the shocking murder. Deep in the quiet suburbs of Texas, where ranch-style homes lined the streets and life moved at a tranquil pace, there was a family that seemed, to the outside world, completely ordinary. Peter McAllister, a man in his mid-50s with a salt-and-pepper beard and a stocky frame, worked as an electrician. His wife, Linda, was the upbeat one, always organizing bake sales at the church or showing up to local fundraisers. Together, they had raised a foster daughter, Angela, since she was just a little girl. To everyone in Rockfield, they were loving, proud guardians of a girl who had flourished into a bright, ambitious young woman. But behind the weathered cedar fence of their modest home and the polite smiles of church interactions, cracks were spreading. Cracks that no one in the sleepy town of Rockfield could have imagined would lead to one of the most grisly, incomprehensible crimes the town had ever seen. Peter McAllister, by most accounts, was a man who struggled silently. He had never been one to wear his emotions on his sleeve, instead bottling them up beneath layers of gruffness and self-reliance. When Angela came into his life as a foster child, she had been only 6 years old, a wide-eyed, nervous girl clinging to her teddy bear as the caseworker explained her troubled background. Linda had taken to Angela immediately, wrapping her in hugs, proudly marking her milestones on the kitchen calendar: first day of school, first recital, first report card posted on the fridge. But Peter found it harder to connect with her in the early years. Though he provided for Angela, taught her to ride a bike and attended school events, their relationship always felt strained, as though fueled more by obligation than genuine affection. Over time, that cold gap between them grew. As Angela blossomed into her teenage years, her free spirit and independence often clashed with Peter's rigid demeanor. Arguments erupted frequently, about curfews, grades, even the way Angela would spend long hours in her room blasting music Peter could never understand. Each fight left Peter more frustrated, more withdrawn. By the time Angela turned 20, she had become a driven young woman, attending a local community college and working part-time to save money for university. She was spirited and bold, unafraid to speak her mind. But her relationship with Peter hadn't improved. If anything, Linda often found herself trying to smooth over the tension between the two, begging both of them to let it go whenever the yelling started. Peter's struggles weren't just limited to Angela. For years he harbored a simmering insecurity. Financial pressures from unexpected medical bills had hit the family hard, and Peter's job hadn't been enough to cover their growing debt. Linda, ever the optimist, worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat, but Peter's pride wouldn't let him admit he felt like a failure. Instead, those frustrations turned inward, eating away at him and outward, in the form of resentment toward Angela. To Peter, Angela's pursuit of higher education felt like a cruel reminder of everything he hadn't achieved. He knew it was irrational, but that didn't stop him from feeling it. One cold winter evening, with the smell of rain lingering in the air, Linda had gone upstairs to bed early, leaving Peter and Angela alone in the living room. Angela had been revising her financial aid applications for school, her laptop open, papers scattered everywhere. She was determined to figure out how to afford transferring to a better university by next semester. "Peter," Angela started, her tone those of frustration, "have you looked at this? Do you even understand how bad this debt is? We need to figure something out, or else we're just going to keep drowning." The comment lit a fuse in Peter that had been ready to ignite for years. He slammed his beer bottle down on the coffee table, his face darkening. "Don't you start with me, Angie," he growled, his voice low and tight. "You've lived under my roof for 20 years. You've been clothed, fed, and taken care of, and now you want to sit there and tell me what I should be doing? Like you have a damn clue about what it's taken to make this house run?" Angela bristled, standing her ground as always. She slammed her laptop shut and crossed her arms. "It's not about what you've done, it's about what you haven't done," she shot back. "You've spent years sitting in your bitterness, making everyone else miserable when you could have been doing something to fix this." "Fix this," Peter spat, rising to his feet. "You think you're so damn smart because you've got a couple of college classes under your belt. You don't know the first thing about responsibility." "Responsibility?" Angela laughed bitterly, her hands trembling with anger. "Maybe you should have figured that out before you wasted years dragging yourself and everyone else through hell. And don't think I don't know how much you hate me for trying to make something of myself. You've always resented me for it, haven't you?" Her words cut deeper than she realized. What happened next was a blur of raw, unfiltered rage. Peter, consumed by years of insecurities and pent-up frustration, saw red. He lunged forward, his hands grasping for Angela as she screamed and stumbled backward. Linda rushed down the stairs at the sound, but by the time she entered the room it was too late. Peter stood there shaking, his face pale, his hands slick with blood, barely registering what he had done. Angela's body lay crumpled on the floor, her wide, unblinking eyes a haunting reflection of the violence that had erupted in their once quiet home. Linda's scream ripped through the night air. What have you done, Peter? What have you done?" But Peter didn't answer her. He didn't even seem to hear her. In the hours that followed, Peter fled the house, grabbing his jacket and keys and running into the growing storm. Linda, trembling and hysterical, called 911, her words barely coherent through sobs as she begged for help. The police found Peter the next morning, hiding in his truck near an abandoned gas station miles out of town. He didn't resist when they arrested him. He didn't say a word as they cuffed him and placed him in the back of the car. The investigation revealed the depths of Peter's struggles, a man buried under years of financial strain, shame, and resentment that had turned to something unrecognizable. Family and friends were left reeling, unable to reconcile the Peter they knew with the man who had taken Angela's life. Linda was inconsolable, haunted not just by the loss of her foster daughter, but by the realization that the man she had loved for decades was capable of such a thing. The community of Rockfield mourned Angela's death, but their mourning was tinged with confusion. How had it come to this? How had a foster father, once thought of as a steady, blue-collar man, been pushed so far that his anger consumed him? When Peter stood trial, the courtroom was filled with faces familiar and foreign, all drawn by the horrific tale of a foster father who had snapped in the worst way imaginable. Psychologists testified about Peter's deteriorating mental state, describing how years of unchecked depression and anxiety had spiraled into rage. Prosecutors, however, argued that no amount of hardship could excuse what he had done. Peter himself said little during the trial, his face a mask of regret and exhaustion, the weight of his actions pressed into the deep lines of his aging face. The case captivated the nation for months, raising difficult questions about family, mental health, and the thin thread that holds us together when the weight of the world becomes too much. Peter McAllister was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but no amount of justice seemed enough to heal the wounds his actions had carved into the hearts of those left behind. For Linda, the life she had worked so hard to build, the family she had fought to hold together, was now nothing more than a memory that would haunt her forever. For Rockfield, the tragedy became an unshakable reminder of how even the most ordinary lives can hide the darkest secrets. And for Angela, the bright, ambitious young woman with her future ahead of her, her life had been stolen by the very person who was supposed to protect her. The tragedy of suppression and depression. Peter McAllister's story wasn't one of instant rage or sudden violence. It was a slow, steady erosion of the man he once was, a process that went unnoticed for years by everyone, including himself. Outwardly, Peter appeared just like any other hard-working blue-collar worker, a man who lived paycheck to paycheck but somehow always carried the weight of his family's needs on his back. But inside, Peter had been quietly struggling, suffocating under layers of self-doubt, financial strain, and an overwhelming sense of failure. The people of Rockfield had always viewed Peter as gruff but dependable. He wasn't one to engage in friendly small talk at the hardware store or linger too long at church after Sunday service. He was the guy who would fix your porch light if it flickered or jumpstart a neighbor's car in the middle of a blizzard with nothing more than a grunt and a wave. He didn't need anyone to like him, at least that's what Peter told himself. What he didn't understand was how deeply he needed to feel respected, accomplished, and in control of his life. Peter's descent into depression and rage wasn't sudden nor theatrical. It was quiet, insidious, and invisible to everyone around him. It began years before Angela died, maybe even long before Angela walked into his life carrying nothing but a tattered teddy bear and the kind of nervous smile that made grown adults weep. It began when Peter started to realize that life wasn't shaping up the way he'd imagined it would. Peter had dreams once, big ones, As a young man just out of high school, he'd envisioned a future where his sharp mechanical mind would take him far. He wasn't book smart, but Peter had a knack for fixing things, piecing together motors and engines with the intuition of a seasoned engineer. Yet life rarely followed the neat plans we lay for ourselves. College wasn't an option for someone like Peter. His father worked as a factory line worker and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Scholarships were for the kids who knew how to write polished essays, not for someone who could rebuild an entire lawnmower before his 18th birthday. He settled into his role as an electrician, taking jobs where he could find them and doing well enough to support himself. When Linda came into his life, Peter's world seemed to stabilize. Her cheery optimism and boundless positivity were a salve to his rough edges, and for a while, Peter felt proud to call her his wife. Together, they bought a modest home in Rockfield, the house with the peeling shutters and a big yard that Linda dreamed of sprucing up with flowers and cheerful pots of herbs. Then came Angela. Fostering a child was Linda's idea, a loving gesture she described as a calling. Peter agreed, though he never felt the same burning drive Linda had. At first, Angela was just the quiet little girl who ended up sleeping in the bedroom down the hall and making Peter slightly nervous when she cried too much or clung to her teddy bear. Over time, she became his daughter, at least legally if not emotionally. What Peter hadn't prepared for was how fostering Angela would force him to confront the very things he tried to avoid his whole life. Angela had fire. She was bold, outspoken, and unapologetically ambitious, a mirror of everything Peter felt he had given up or failed to achieve. As she grew older, her academic achievements, her independence, her bright future, all these things that should have filled Peter with pride, instead filled him with resentment. To Peter, she was a force of nature that reminded him of every lost opportunity he'd let slip through his fingers or been denied. The foster care checks had helped the family in the lean years, especially with Linda's health issues piling on medical bills they couldn't afford. But even as Peter worked himself to the bone, picking up every side job he couldn't shake the feeling that he was drowning. His electrician job kept the lights on, but the debts kept growing, and Linda's tireless optimism felt more like false hope with every passing year. Peter didn't talk about his struggles, not to Linda, not to Angela, not even to himself. Feelings, after all, were for people with time to deal with them, not for men holding their lives together with duct tape and sheer grit. That was the dangerous trick depression played on Peter. It convinced him that asking for help would make him weak, that he didn't deserve it, and that his failure to fix life on his own was proof he wasn't enough. Over time, his insecurities turned into irritability, then bitterness. His interactions with Angela became shorter, harsher. Her loud music, her questions about their finances, her unrelenting determination to rise above their circumstances, all of it grated on Peter like sandpaper against raw skin. The night of Angela's death was more than just a tragic outburst. It was the violent collision of years of suppressed emotions, unmet expectations, and silent grief, all compressed into a single moment of uncontrollable rage. Peter wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been falling apart in slow motion for decades, invisible to everyone around him. The argument between them was never supposed to end in blood. It had started like so many others before it, with Angela laying out the realities of their financial situation, and Peter reading between her lines. He wasn't doing enough. He wasn't enough. He saw her accusations, real or imagined, as confirmation of every dark thought he'd buried in the back of his mind. "You've always resented me!" Angela had shouted, her voice cutting through the living room like a razor. And Peter, in that instant, didn't see Angela. He saw every failed paycheck, every missed opportunity, every sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was good enough for Linda, for Angela, for the image of the father and man he thought he should have been. The aftermath of that night reverberated far beyond the McAllister household. To their neighbors in Rockfield, Peter's crime came as a chilling shock. How could a man who showed up to church on Sundays and grumbled his way through parent-teacher conferences be capable of such horror? Small-town gossip filled the air. Some blamed Angela for pushing Peter too far, others blamed Linda for not seeing the signs, but most simply whispered about the quiet tragedy of Peter's fragile masculinity and Angela's stubborn determination colliding in the most unimaginable way. Linda bore the brunt of the fallout, not just because she had lost Angela, but because she had also lost Peter, her husband, to a lifetime in prison. She struggled to reconcile the man she married with the man she found standing over their foster daughter's body that fateful night. The psychologists who examined Peter for the trial had plenty of theories. They spoke at length in court about how long-term depression and anxiety could metastasize into uncontrollable rage if left unaddressed. They described Peter as emotionally isolated, a man whose identity as a provider had been eroded by financial stress, health crises, and an unspoken sense of failure. But the prosecutors had no patience for excuses. They argued that refusing to deal with your emotions wasn't a justification for murder. They painted Peter as a man who allowed his bitterness to grow unchecked until it consumed the very person he was supposed to protect. For Peter, the trial was barely more than a formality. He rarely spoke, his once gruff presence reduced to a shell of regret and exhaustion. He accepted his life sentence without protest, perhaps because he felt he deserved it. In Rockfield, the tragedy became more than just an act of violence. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of silence, suppression, and unchecked despair. It forced the town to confront difficult truths about mental health, generational trauma, and how the weight of unspoken struggles could crush even the strongest-seeming people. For Linda, the house where she had raised her family became a shell, filled with memories she couldn't bear to relive but couldn't escape. And for Angela, the vibrant, determined young woman with her whole life ahead of her, her tragic ending became a stark reminder of how easily love and resentment can coexist, and how devastating the results can be when one finally overtakes the other. Lessons from brutal tragedies. The haunting tales of George Conway and Peter McAllister are more than just grim chapters of small-town America. They are mirrors reflecting deeper truths about human fragility and the dangerous paths people can take when cornered by despair and unresolved emotions. These stories grip us not only because of the shocking events themselves, but because they strike a nerve, revealing how close anyone could come to a breaking point when left without support, without hope, and without the ability to address hidden struggles. Each tragedy carries its own set of circumstances, yet beneath the surface lurk shared elements: isolation, simmering resentment, unchecked mental health struggles, and a community's failure to intervene before it's too late. These harrowing tales serve as stark reminders of how quickly an ordinary life can spiral into chaos and violence. But they also provide lessons. Lessons that, while drawn from heartbreak, offer a path toward understanding, prevention, and healing. The danger of suppressed emotions. In both George and Peter's stories, the perpetrators were not men who woke up one day as monsters. They were individuals caught in the maelstrom of life's pressures, weighed down by emotions they didn't know how to process or express. For George, the burden of protecting a family under threat by a relentless bully became a silent and suffocating obsession. He convinced himself that violence was the only solution when the law had failed him. On the other hand, for Peter, years of suppressed self-doubt, financial stress, and growing resentment toward Angela's ambition created a ticking time bomb. By burying his insecurities instead of confronting them, Peter let bitterness fester until it became an uncontrollable rage. Both men lived lives where vulnerability was viewed as weakness. They didn't feel they could express fear, anxiety, or frustration in ways that might have diffused the tension building in their hearts and minds. These stories illuminate a vital lesson. Emotions, especially negative ones, cannot be ignored or bottled up indefinitely. Suppressed pain will eventually demand release, often in destructive ways. For individuals, this means reaching out when the weight becomes too heavy. For communities, it means paying attention, creating spaces where conversations about mental health can be normalized and showing empathy instead of judgment. The ripple effect of isolation. Another tragic commonality in these stories was the persistent sense of isolation that enveloped both men. George felt abandoned by the system, the police dismissing Rebecca's pleas for help, the lack of accountability for Charles Duran's harassment, and the absence of any realistic pathway to protect his family without taking matters into his own hands. Peter's isolation was more internalized. He spent years masking his sense of inadequacy beneath a tough exterior, believing that asking for help would make him appear weak. What these experiences reveal is the profound danger posed by isolation. It may not always be physical loneliness, it can be the isolation created by societal pressures, personal pride, or unaddressed shame. When people believe they must face their struggles alone, whether protecting a family or enduring financial ruin, they can spiral into desperation and make decisions that harm everyone around them. The lesson here is that connection saves lives. It's about creating a culture where reaching out for help isn't stigmatized, but celebrated. Where schools, workplaces, and families have systems in place to promote collaboration, communication, and collective solutions. From simple acts of checking in on a friend, to larger systemic policies that create access to affordable mental health care, connection is the strongest antidote to isolation. Mental health is not optional. Perhaps the most glaring oversight in both stories is the lack of recognition or support for the mental health struggles that haunted George and Peter. Neither man likely had the vocabulary or the opportunity to articulate their pain. They grew up in a culture where perseverance was valued above vulnerability and silence was preferred over seeking help. George's slow unraveling wasn't noticed by anyone, not even Rebecca, until it reached its breaking point. The quiet hero archetype he embraced left no room for admitting fear or seeking external guidance, even as the danger escalated. Similarly, Peter's gradual disintegration wasn't dramatic enough to raise alarms. He wasn't violent or visibly unstable. He was just a man worn thin by life's pressures, lost in the shadows of his unspoken struggles. The lesson here is an urgent one. Mental health isn't a secondary concern. It's foundational to family stability, community safety, and personal well-being. Awareness campaigns can only go so far without real action. Ensuring everyone has access to affordable counseling, creating educational initiatives that teach emotional intelligence from a young age, and fostering communities that understand emotional well-being is fundamental, not optional. How inaction enables tragedy. The systemic failures present in both tales also shine a spotlight on how inaction, by individuals and institutions, can enable these tragedies. In George's case, the legal system failed him and his family. His pleas for intervention against Charles were dismissed or ignored, with law enforcement writing it off as just neighborly disputes. That negligence not only emboldened Charles but also left George to believe he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. Peter's tragedy, on the other hand, was marked by societal inaction rather than legal negligence. His pain was quiet and hidden, but it was compounded by a culture that didn't acknowledge his struggle. Financial insecurity, a lack of mental health resources, and unspoken societal expectations forced him to carry burdens no one should face unsupported. From these failures comes a key lesson. Systems and communities must be proactive. Whether it's law enforcement taking harassment seriously, or neighbors actively noticing signs of mental strain, lives can be saved when action replaces complacency. Society must be vigilant, not dismissive when someone demonstrates signs of desperation through words or actions. Compassion, not condemnation. It can be tempting to pass judgment on men like George and Peter, to label them as criminals or villains and separate their actions from their motivations. But their tragedies remind us that underneath these violent acts were years of suffering and fears that went unseen and unresolved. Compassion doesn't mean excusing their crimes, it means taking the time to understand the factors that led them to such desperation and ensuring those same patterns don't repeat themselves in others. Compassion begins with listening. It begins with asking how rather than judging why. How did someone get to a point where their pain overwhelmed their humanity? How could intervention have prevented it? How can communities shift to prevent others from walking the same lonely road? Emphasizing human connection. If there is one overarching lesson to take from these tragedies, it's that no one should have to bear the weight of their struggles alone. In both George's and Peter's cases, their actions were fueled by feelings of helplessness and isolation, emotional burdens they couldn't or wouldn't share with others. The antidote to such overwhelming despair is clear: human connection. Communities thrive when their members look out for one another, when families foster open communication, and when help is accessible and judgment-free. It's not just counseling services and intervention programs that make a difference. It's the simple but profound act of showing up, of being present for someone when they need it most. In the end, the tragic tales of George Conway and Peter McAllister underscore one simple truth: humans are fragile creatures who need care, understanding, and connection to survive and thrive. The moments that spiral into violence don't exist in a vacuum. They are the culmination of lives lived in silence, pain, and isolation. The lessons are painful, but they are also hopeful. These are reminders that we can choose better. We can choose to listen. We can choose to understand, and ultimately, we can choose to act.